Modern superheroes are some of the most iconic characters in many different kinds of medium. These characters have evolved over time through different media and technology. In this video, we'll walk through some of the most influential innovations and cultural events that have affected the portrayal of superheroes. The first innovation that would lead to the creation of superheroes was the printing press in 1429, which allowed for the printed publications like newspapers and magazines, and by extension, the first comics. In 1825, the Glasgow Looking Glass, a Scottish magazine, published the first comic strip, History of a Coat. And then, in 1895, the first American newspaper strip, Hogan's Alley, was published, featuring the adorable Yellow Kid. Comic strips rose to popularity from here on as they led to an increase in newspaper sales. In the 1880s to the 1930s, millions of Jews in Eastern Europe moved to America in search for religious freedom. The economic conditions of the Depression forced these immigrants to employ get-rich-quick schemes to make a living. A collection of these individuals pioneered the comic book industry. Maxie Gaines published the first comic book, Famous Funnies, in 1934, with the help of Harry L. Wildenberg. The comic book was made by reprinting old newspaper strips onto full pages and stitching them together into books. Gaines continued to sell these reprints successfully until 1938, when he started to run out of material. In 1938, Action Comics #1 was published featuring the first superhero, Superman, who was created by Joel Shuster and Jerry Siegel 5 years prior. This marked the start of the golden age of comics. The superhero archetype was developed, differentiating themselves from pulp magazine heroes like the Phantom, the Shadow, and Doc Savage. Superheroes at the time were costumed heroes with extraordinary abilities and secret identities, while pulp heroes were just men of mystery. This archetype resonated with children as superheroes like Superman, Batman, Captain America, Captain Marvel, or now Shazam, and Wonder Woman were introduced. World War II made superheroes more popular as many of them were used for propaganda, inspiring children and young adults to support their country. Superheroes became so popular, a series of 17 Superman animated short films were released between 1941 and 1943. The series was canceled due to its enormous budget. Fun fact, before the animated series, Superman could only leap tall buildings in a single bound. But he was made to fly in the show because it was cheaper to animate than jumping. After the war, society was tired of violence and turned against superheroes. Parents believed that superhero comics were the cause of a rise in juvenile delinquency at the time. In 1945, an editorial in the Chicago Daily claimed comics strained the eyes and the nervous system of viewers and stimulated violent and lurid behaviors. In the face of criticism, the Comic Magazine Association of America was formed in 1947 to regulate the content of comics. It seemed like superheroes were back in the public graces, with the first live-action Superman movie series being released in January of '48 with great success. That was when psychiatrist and actual supervillain Dr. Frederick Wertham began his tirade against superhero comics. He released various articles and public statements rallying the public to his side. In December of 1948, there were public comic book burnings held all over the country. Because of this, many superhero comics were replaced with stories from other genres like Western, sci-fi, detective, and romance. Superman was one of the few heroes that held on, even getting a slight boost in popularity by having the first superhero TV show.
The Adventures of Superman.
This didn't deter Wertham. He dealt the final blow when he released The Seduction of Innocence in 1954. This book caused the U.S. Senate to investigate the effects of comic books on children. This led to the creation of the Comics Code Authority in the same year. Stores would only sell comics that had the CCA stamp on them, meaning they followed certain guidelines. This was the end of the golden age of comics. Going into the Silver Age, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman were the only superheroes running under their original titles. The Silver Age of comics started in 1956 with reboots of canceled superheroes like The Flash and Green Lantern, which were revamped to stay within the CCA guidelines. This made superhero comics more playful and childish. Many new superheroes were created during this time, especially from the upcoming Marvel Comics, which was technically owned by DC Comics at the time. This included the Fantastic Four, X-Men, Spider-Man, and the Incredible Hulk. A defining factor of the Silver Age was a new focus on science. Many superheroes got their origin story from relatively scientific means. Even the new Green Lantern's superpowers was changed from magic to extraterrestrial. The X-Men got their powers from a genetic mutation, and the Fantastic Four from exposure to cosmic radiation. This focus on science was because at the time, space exploration and nuclear warfare were a big deal. Superheroes were slowly being publicly accepted again. At the same time, the American television era was taking off as the television was becoming a household device. Most features were shown in movie theaters, but production industries realized that television was a better medium of choice for families. This led to new superhero shows like the 1966 live-action Batman series, the animated shows Spider-Man, and the Marvel superheroes, both premiering in 1967. These TV shows were extremely successful as they were something new and exciting, with the Batman show airing 2 episodes a week at its height. This popularity was short-lived as the shows had poor graphics and silly storylines, just like the Silver Age of comic books, causing adults to lose interest. As the 1960s came to an end, more successful superhero TV shows appeared, like Wonder Woman, Green Hornet, and Incredible Hulk. Even some originals like The Greatest American Hero with the Greatest American theme song.
Look at what's happened to me. I can't believe.
But by the 1970s, most of these shows were failures. Even those featuring popular superheroes like Captain America, Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, and The Flash. Some movies were made in a similar fashion, but the technology just wasn't there to make them believable. The Bronze Age started in the early 70s as many social groups were formed to fight oppression and bigotry, as well as support feminists, liberal, and civil rights movements. Additionally, the start of the Vietnam War was very controversial among the American people. Superhero comics started to reflect this attitude to become more relevant and shake off the juvenile impression of superheroes created in the Silver Age. Heroes had more depth and started questioning their motives. In 1974, Captain America himself abandoned his alias and became Nomad because he no longer had faith in the American government and was lost. Female superheroes became more prominent and independent. Invisible Girl became Invisible Woman and became the leader of the Fantastic Four. Wasp became the leader of the Avengers. Minority superheroes like Luke Cage, Black Panther, Storm, and Falcon were introduced as well. Another factor that led to Bronze Age was the rise of the underground comic scene. These comics fought the power by delving into subject matter banned by the CCA, especially drug use, sexuality, and violence. These comics were distributed through unconventional channels like head shops, which are known for selling paraphernalia for drugs. This allowed comics to gain a decent amount of success without the CCA, since everyone was high in the 70s. Specialty comic book stores were created in the early 70s to mitigate the popularity of underground comics, but it was too late. The Comics Code had lost its grip. Mainstream comics started to release content that didn't follow the Comics Code. In 1971, Green Lantern, Green Arrow, number 85, tackled drug abuse, with Green Arrow's sidekick struggling as a junkie. In The Amazing Spider-Man 122, Spider-Man had to struggle with the death of his girlfriend, Gwen Stacy. In Demon in the Bottle, Iron Man struggles against alcoholism. Even with the advent of substantial content in comic books, sales began to decline. This was due to the rise of comic book collecting. In 1970, comic book fan Robert M. Overstreet launched the annual Overstreet Comic Book Pricing Guide, which analyzed the value of comic books, taking into account their condition and demand on a national level. This gave comic book owners and collectors more power when selling their comics, as well as more incentive since they were sure how much they were really worth instead of being lowballed by comic book stores. This made comic book collecting bigger than ever, as many people looked to the value comic books should have in the future. However, because comic book distributors only reported the number of comics sold, individuals purchasing more than one copy wasn't accounted for. The increased purchases of comics led to an artificial inflation of the market, as publishers only say a high rate of purchase. Comic book publishers started flooding the market with comics because the demand for them seemed high. As there was so much to collect, collectors started dropping up quickly, almost killing the comic book industry. Furthermore, the comics being collected were virtually worthless, as so many copies of them were sold. Golden Age comics are only worth so much because of their rarity, especially since so many of them were burnt in the 40s. In fact, in 2014, Action Comics #1 was sold on eBay for more than $3 million. Back in 1978, the first Christopher Reeve Superman film was released. With a budget of $55 million, it was the most expensive movie ever made at the time. This allowed them to employ the best special effects, gaining them an Academy Award, and adding credibility to the movie's tagline, "You'll believe a man can fly." The movie spawned 3 sequels of varying success and led to the licensing of Superman and other popular superheroes for various products like superhero games, action figures, apparel, amusement parks, and snacks. This kept superheroes relevant in the public eye, even though they were dying in the medium of origin. In 1978, Will Eisner popularized graphic novels, also known as trade paperbacks, with his comic A Contract with God. The graphic novel is a collection of single issues in one comic. Publishers adopted this format for superhero stories like Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns and Alan Moore's Watchmen, both in 1986, kicking off the modern age of comics. As graphic novels offered a longer form of storytelling, superhero stories became deeper, grimmer, and self-reflective as they had more time to flesh out characters. Storylines became grittier and realistic, and many superheroes were re-envisioned to have personal issues and questioned their morality and mortality. The graphic novel format also made superheroes accessible to new audiences as it made it easy to catch up on long-running series. The rise of the graphic novel coincided with the British invasion of comics. This started in a group of British writers, and some Scottish, we aren't forgetting you, Grant Morrison, who rose to prominence in the late 1980s while working on American comics. Some of the more popular writers in the movement were Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Peter Milligan, and Grant Morrison, who had all previously worked on the British anthology series 2000 AD before moving in with DC. These artists brought in a new literary style and a mature sensibility to American comics with graphic novels like Watchmen, V for Vendetta, Arkham Asylum, and The Killing Joke. This also saw the return of horror stories with comics like Hellblazer, Shade the Changing Man, Sandman, and Swamp Thing rise to popularity. This mature outlook on superheroes influenced American creators to the rise of anti-heroes like Wolverine, Deadpool, Punisher, and Spawn. Yay, killing! All in all, comic books became very successful during this time as they were critically acclaimed and drew in more mature audiences. But it wasn't only changes in content that made superhero comics successful again, an improved production process helped as well. Comics had always been hand-drawn, with numerous artists having to do penciling, inking, and coloring, but in 1984, the process was revolutionized with the release of the first-generation Apple Macintosh. In 1985, the first digital comic Shatter was released. Although it was pixelated and difficult to illustrate, it no longer involved manual color separation like older comics did. In 1990, the release of Photoshop 1.0 helped with the digital coloring and drawing. This made comic book production faster and cheaper, with a wider range of colors and a finer gradation. The rise in popularity of superhero comics led to 1992's Batman the Animated Series. This show was so successful, it led to many spin-off series all through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, including Superman the Animated Series, Batman Beyond, Static, Justice League, and Justice League Unlimited. Collectively, these shows were known as the DC Animated Universe, as many of their characters tended to cross over. These shows were darker and more serious than older superhero shows, reflecting their comics of the era. The Batman animated series was so popular, it got a movie, Batman, Mask of the Phantasm, released in theaters as well as 3 other direct-to-video movies. Marvel attempted to replicate DC's success with X-Men in 1992. Which increased the popularity of the characters so much that when the relaunched X-Men #1 came out a year later, it sold over 7 million copies, a record which hasn't been broken ever since. A couple more series followed after that, including the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, and Iron Man. It seemed like everything was going great for comic books until the Joel Schumacher Batman movies. With the success of Christopher Reeve's Superman movies, a Tim Burton-directed Batman movie was released in 1989. After an okay Batman sequel, Tim Burton moved on to other projects, leaving Joel Schumacher to make Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, which nearly single-handedly sunk the entire genre of superhero movies in 2 fell swoops. Loud, garnish, and over-the-top, his 2 Batman films were stuffed with bizarre performances and ended up as campy, neon-lit smears on the superhero canvas. Superheroes were seen as a joke again, leading to another collapse of the superhero genre across all media. In the mid-1990s, novelty comic book covers such as hologram covers, alternate covers, and other gimmicks became very popular, as well as contrived stories lacking any substantial content. This was done in a bid to keep superhero comics relevant, but instead led to a decline of comic book sales. Comic books like The Death of Superman, Batman Nightfall, Spider-Man clone sagas annoyed comic book fans, again killing the industry as they started to drop off. In 1996, Marvel declared bankruptcy because of debt. In a bid to stay afloat, Marvel auctioned off the film rights of some of their most popular characters, including the X-Men, Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, and Daredevil. The first deal came with Blade in 1989, followed by X-Men in 2000 and Spider-Man in 2002. These movies were massively successful, with Spider-Man becoming the first film to pass the 100 million mark in a single weekend. The success of these movies started the reemergence of the comic book and superhero film genre. Unfortunately, because of the wording in the licensing deals, Marvel only made a couple $1,000s for the movies. This is when Marvel made a plan to produce their own films, with their remaining superheroes giving them total creative control and more financial gain if they succeeded. As they were out of money, Marvel had to create various animated movies like Doctor Strange, Ultimate Avengers 2, and The Invincible Iron Man as proof of concepts to financial backers. As Marvel was preparing for the cinematic universe, the return of the superhero TV show had begun in 2001 with Smallville, a show about a young Superman in his eponymous hometown. Smallville took a cue from the 1993 TV show Lewis and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, which found mild success by focusing on Superman's romantic relationship rather than superheroics. Smallville did the same thing, making the show cheaper and more believable, allowing it to run for 10 seasons. DC found success once again in live-action films with the 2005's Batman Begins, which led to the critically acclaimed film Dark Knight and the critically mediocre Dark Knight Returns. These films gained some respect for superheroes as they were directed by visionary director Christopher Nolan and had deep themes, many which were reminiscent of terrorist events in 9/11. In fact, Heath Ledger won a posthumous Academy Award for playing the Joker in The Dark Knight. The popularity of superheroes in TV shows, live-action movies, and animations in the early 2000s led to many new comic book fans. Online comic book readers became popular around this time because they allowed for easy accessibility of comic books by new fans and made comic book sharing easier. In 2008, comic book reader applications like Comixology, Panelfly, and others were released for phone and tablet and became the most ideal medium for comic book distribution. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, or MCU, released their first movie, Iron Man, in 2008. Iron Man demonstrated a good use of CGI for realistic effects beyond what any superhero movie had done before it. It became the 11th highest grossing movie of all time and led to various other MCU movies far surpassing its record. Superheroes also started becoming more successful in the video game medium with the release of Batman Arkham Origins in 2009, leading to the Arkham series, the most popular and best-selling superhero video game series ever made. DC's video game success continued a few years later with Injustice: Gods Among Us, which was so popular it led to a spin-off of comic book series. With Smallville coming to an end in 2012, its network, the CW, decided to take on more superhero shows like Arrow, and improved CGI and comic book industry involvement made it feasible to focus on superhero action and heroics again. Arrow was massively popular, even more than Smallville, leading to various spin-off series like The Flash, Legends of Tomorrow, and Supergirl. In 2013, Marvel began to make shows that tied into their cinematic universe with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Marvel's Agent Carter on ABC. That same year, Marvel partnered with Netflix to produce live-action superhero series for Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Iron Fist, and Luke Cage, all of which would be largely popular over the next few years. Because these shows were not broadcast on live television, it allowed them to be darker and more violent, catering to a new audience of fans. Yay, killing! In the summer of 2013, DC started their own cinematic universe with Man of Steel, followed by Suicide Squad and Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. Although these movies haven't been received well critically, they have been massively profitable, furthering the popularity of the superhero genre.
Because a vision softly creeping.
The superhero genre has proven to be extremely popular in all forms of media throughout history, as heroes can easily adapt to the cultural landscape of the time and reflect the ideals and struggles of society. They will continue to evolve with technology, influence our culture, and grow in popularity through new media.